So in the first essay, It's All About the Land, the author says, reconciliation is recolonization, that there's no way to decolonize from within the reconciliation paradigm. So, Chris, my question, I know it's a big one, but can you explain why reconciliation is a process of recolonization?
I'll touch on some provocative ideas that have deeper meaning to them that are explained in the books, and we can have conversations. But basically, I think the largest premise that runs throughout this whole book is that so the land was stolen, dispossessed. I mean, there's a lot of ways of saying that. And stolen seems as if someone came up on you with a gun, and sometimes it literally happened that way. But then there's also dispossession through policy, through that kind of thing. And that's what we're seeing here is reconciliation as recolonization. And because of the land issue, Sharon Venn talks about that in her article on Crown Land. It has to do with the doctrine of discovery. And so long as the doctrine of discovery and concepts of terra nullius, the idea that when Europeans first landed here, that they claimed these lands under those policies. Those were policies in the day. And from that policy of doctrine of discovery, successive colonial regimes have staked their claim. Canada being one of the more recent ones in 1867, for the British North America Act, staked their claim on this land, the Dominion of Canada. And from that, you're talking about the underlying crown or underlying crown title. The idea that through the doctrine of discovery, that these lands were empty, that nobody here existed, it robs the indigenous people of their culture, of their agency, of their political economy that had been living here for 10,000 years and developing, growing. And then that is, so here now, reconciliation, it's a form of politics of recognition is the term. It's about recognition power. At the core of that, we're moving away from the Truro Wampum belt, the two partners, nation to nation. We're moving away from a nation to nation equitable relationship, and what colonization and settler colonialism is almost very similar to what we see in a first world and a third world, because Canada does not own the lands. They have to continuously exploit it and take advantage of it and protect it through policy. Whereas we see that right now, that I feel like it's a very heavy week, very heavy couple of weeks, not only with the discovery of those young children in the graves. Bill C-15 received the final vote today, I believe it was this morning, last night. So that Bill C-15, when you really look into that, that's why I kind of had a little snicker when you asked that question, because that the land was just recolonized. We just went through a whole recolonization process, and hardly anybody was aware of it.
Can you say more about that? So I knew that Bill C-15 was coming down the pipeline. How does it relate to recolonization? It
recenters that doctrine of discovery as the core relation, like the core ethic of relationship. To your second question here in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the 1763 Royal Proclamation was meant, if you think of drawing a blank on the term, there is a lineage of treaties, a heritage of treaties amongst the Wabanaki, the covenant chain of treaties, that's the concept. Which goes right back to the early wampum treaties. And those early wampum treaties, if you look at the language of that, it's we are partners, we are siblings, we are sharing this territory. And there was definitely an acknowledgement that the newcomers were here. In 1763, the Royal Proclamation, I mean, we're very familiar with like omnibus bills or the political trickery of bills, that if you don't read these bills and the devil's in the details, that is the kind of story behind the treaty process, the peace and friendship treaties for us here in Wabanaki, but the broader treaty process across Canada, across North America, and you can even extend that across all of the Americas. So the Royal Proclamation, Sharon Venn points out in her articles why the Royal Proclamation is important to us. But as those treaties were signed between Indigenous leadership and the British Crown, so those had to go. Those treaties went back to London, and they became codified. They became law. They gained royal assent through that process, and in that's where you see a lot of that political trickery, the inclusion, taking the oral tradition, the arrangements, the peace and friendship arrangements that were negotiated on the ground here, peace and friendship, and then it fits a broader narrative. It fits a broader imperialist narrative. The core of it that I think a lot of these articles here are talking about is the core is the land, but it's also not just about settlement at the time. At the time, it's about resource extraction in any form, and to gain access to that. So settlement, colonization and settlement was meant to secure what was taken.
Sure.
So at the end result, we have, so I feel today, we have two distinct Canadas. We have the state of Canada that is made very clearly, I think, in Sharon Venn's article, and that's the dirty one. That's the one that we're fighting with. That's the trickery one. And then you have the people, the people, and that comes in all different shapes and sizes. And what is your country? What is Canada? What is our country?
Can you, before we leave the British North America Act and the Royal Proclamation of 1963, how is that proclamation relevant to legal title? I mean, of Indigenous people over their territories. Is that something is supporting Indigenous land claims in the courts?
Again, it is in the sense that it's recognizing that there's always been this chain of title, this chain of ownership, that Indigenous people occupied this land, use this land as territory. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was reaffirmed on the ground in these territories as a Treaty of Niagara in 1764. And those two should be read together.
Okay.
And it's so much that in the Royal Proclamation, in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that was published in 1996, one of their primary suggestions, calls to action, was to develop a new proclamation, a new Royal Proclamation, so that we can sit down together as equal people in this day and age. And that was missed. That opportunity was strategically denied.
Sure.
It works better. I mean, it just comes down to again, that resource extraction. It works better for resource industries if their business operations are subsidized by stolen land or free land.
Of course.
If you have to pay for it, and that's what Bolivia is doing. If you look at what Bolivia's been doing in the last couple of years, they're nationalizing their land. They're taking what we think of as concepts of crown land and putting that in trust for future generations. And they're not shutting down resource extraction. They're controlling it and regulating it in a way that doesn't harm the earth, that includes the people, that just redistributes funds equitably and things like that. So it's about, today in our crown lands, a new Royal Proclamation for me, from my perspective, and the people that I'm working with on the ground here, it's about looking at the crown lands of, say, New Brunswick, and how can we, like, as Indigenous folk, if that's our territory, that's how would those lands be cared for? How would they be taken care of if they were in the care of Indigenous protocols to land? If Indigenous relationships to the land were centered first. You shared an article in the a video from Pam Palmater.
Yes, yeah.
On the Facebook page where she talks about that. I want to talk about that too, because she failed to mention, well, not failed, but forgot to leave out one important thing about political reformation, governance reformation.
Right. Okay.
So the Royal Proclamation is used today, but it's like, even now with Bill C-15, which is a Canadian version of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous people, all of these things, sadly, I'm learning that all of these goodwill measures, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, have always been filtered upwards within a colonial hierarchical corporate structure, really. All of these things come from the grassroots and they get fed up through the system. That's something that
Right.
we all deal with living in these liberal type of countries, whether we're Indigenous or not.
Yeah.
Our future growth is dependent on and we're seeing the limitations of that upward filtering now. If we talk about like community-based policies around protecting our future from nuclear energy or pollution or climate change, any want, need, and desire of the people on the ground has to get filtered through government, has to get filtered through those kind of policy networks. And then that's where the heart of the meat of these regulatory reforms are taken away.
Yeah, and as a testament to that, I can report that I don't even remember now if it was earlier this week or late last week, but I was on a national people from different environmental organizations, and there were a lot of people on that call. And the ask was, we know it's not a great climate action accountability bill, but we're hoping people will support it because it's better than nothing. And it just seems so disheartening to me that so many bright people were having to say, yeah, it's as much as we're going to get out of this government right now, and we don't want to risk the election coming and having nothing once it's called. So we really do have a huge roadblock, and it's not that it's just one government or one bill. It's a system. Right?
Did you have a chance to listen to the MP from Nunavut? I can't pronounce her name that well.
Right.
Mumlak.
No, I didn't.
So she recently, last night or night before, so she's still in her position, but she's not reoffering in the next election.
Oh, interesting.
So she had an opportunity to provide a farewell speech last night.
Yeah.
You can see it, it's been shared everywhere.
Okay.
And she just really cuts to the heart of the matter, saying a lot of the things that you're touching on here. The system itself, I've been doing a lot of my part of my research where I'm in now. I'm looking at political economy and the evolution of political economy within colonial societies,
Yeah.
settler colonial societies. So like Canada, how does that work? So a lot of that has to be looking at the Westminster parliamentary system. And, there's a lot of questions in that, like what is the role of an executive council in the Westminster system?
Yeah.
Why do we have a prime minister? Why do we have political parties in this type of system?
Yeah.
Couldn't the system operate better if you were beholden to political parties? If MPs, members of parliament at the federal level or the local level were able to, vote their constituents, their conscience and their constituents, instead of first having to toe a party line.
Yeah.
And I think with Jody Wilson-Raybould and a few other prominent people, Jenica Atwin, what's happening with the Green Party now, we're starting to see, I think, I don't know, maybe no one else is seeing it, but I'm paying a lot closer attention to how politics is done and made here in Canada, and there is a lot of room for change.
Of
is
course,
what I see.
yeah.
Like you say, a lot of people I work with, people in your position and NGO volunteers, people that are fisher people, people that are unemployed, that never, like, you meet a lot of grassroots people that are volunteering in different positions. Rural New Brunswick, I can see how, like, we can make a lot of changes if a lot of our people become political consciousness. And I'm not just talking about Indigenous folk. As Indigenous peoples, I'm becoming aware of the limitations of Canada's political economy, or Canada as a free and democratic, fair society. I'm recognizing the limitations of that through an Indigenous lens, through my mother lens. But I'm also recognizing that through so many other lenses that are out there today. You hear from the experience of so many other people were, again, so, and then those voices, I don't know if you heard in Florida, The legislators in Florida banned teaching critical race theory in high school. I didn't know they were teaching that in high school, but they banned it from a high school curriculum.
Jeez.
Why?
I know. I
So
mean, we could
there are broader
spend a
questions.
whole night talking about
Right.
the U.S. and also our political system, which is, you know, completely flawed. I want to bring you back for a moment to, you know, how colonialism is plays out here. So the late Arthur Manuel, he's got a few essays in this book that we're reading. And he says, and I'm going to quote him here, colonialism has three components: dispossession, dependence, and oppression. And when it comes to dependence, he says, it's important to note that our poverty is not a byproduct of domination, but it's an essential element of it. He goes on to say, the brilliance of the Canadian system as it has evolved is that today our poverty and misery are actually administered by our own people. In a spirit that seems profoundly insulting, this system is even called by some self-government. Self-government, as designed by the Canadian government, is a system where we administer our own poverty. Tell us about this system that the Canadian state has imposed on Indigenous people.
Well, the Canadian settler colonial state. I was looking at the Scramble for Africa. If you want to do a little Google search for the people that are listening to that too. That was the cut up of Africa in the 1880s and the Berlin Conference in 1884. I'm looking at in comparison to the numbered treaties, which took place in the 70s and then in the late 1890s. I think it's all the same kind of thing. If you look at dispossession, dependence, and oppression in what we think of the third world or developing countries, continents like Africa, you can very clearly see how that dispossession, dependence on the first world, their commodities, whatever, and that oppression in other places around the world, places like in Africa, sometimes hard to see in our own backyard here in Canada. But for me, it's, I don't know, it seems like more gangsterism than it does capitalism or politics. It's about how do you, go ahead.
Sorry, Chris, but there's one part about that quote that I read where Arthur Manuel is talking about the brilliance of the Canadian system, that it has, that this system is actually being administered by our own people. So I believe he's referring to the band council system.
Yeah.
And you know, we also learn in the reading by, or the essay by Russell Diabo, you know, that this system that's been, he calls it socially engineered to basically, you know, conquer and divide Indigenous communities further. They are being, you know, led now by band councils and perhaps the Assembly of First Nations. Can you describe for us how those systems function and how they're not traditional systems?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was referring to with Pam Palmer. What was left out of her video in that is she doesn't go into detail about she's talking about land back and how we go about getting land back. Are we prepared, as like we talk about reconciliation? And for me, reconciliation and resurgence is about restorative resurgence. The Assembly of First Nations is basically an extension of the federal government. The Assembly of First Nations started as a National Indian Brotherhood, NIB. You can find some history behind that. And they were a very, I wouldn't say militant organization, but very willful, knowledgeable about their rights. And in 1969, when the first white paper was proposed by Jean Chrétien, the representation from the National Indian Brotherhood stood up against that, resisted that. And forced Canada to change its change its extinguishment policy towards Indigenous rights. If not for the National Indian Brotherhood in 1969, a lot of what's happening today would have just been pushed through like a lot of other statutes and changes to the Indian Act all along, because in 1969, our people, were still confined a lot of ways by social control. From 1969 up into the Constitutional Express in 1981, 82, I forget exactly when that was, you see a series of co-option, co-opting the National Indian Brotherhood. And that's where I say, if you study the history of governments and politics and international politics and those kind of things, you see a lot of this first world countries regime. You hear the terms today. In the third world country, you have benevolent dictators.
Mm-hmm.
And it's those benevolent dictators that keep their people in line, and then keep the whatever that is, whether it's oil, lithium, cobalt, copper, human souls, whatever. That benevolent dictatorship keeps its people in line by whatever means, with being supported by the colonizing or imperialist entity. Within this, it's harder to see in North America, a little easier to see in South America, but in North America, you can't really see that in Canada. So the Assembly of First Nations, which started out as this very strong, powerful voice for Indigenous peoples, became co-opted. And there's a lot of other mechanisms that go along with that, and that involves the corporatization of universities and schooling, and how you learn and what you learn. If you go to business school and economic development and you only learn, if you only read Fraser Institute publications, you're only going to get one particular perspective on what political economy is and how to move forward. Mm-hmm. And so that's where our people are today. The Assembly of First Nations controls the information that our local communities get. Mm-hmm. Since the Liberals came into power, I don't know what the number is. There are some research reports out there, but you're looking at the Assembly of First Nations annual budget going up by 200-300%. And that's very basic. You have a population of people, and it's very easy. Not easy. It's not healthy. It's not well. It's not good. But you can keep people in control in very nefarious ways. We're seeing that with the residential schools. There's a very direct correlation between why all this is happening now, why these bodies are coming up now, why we're finding these survivors, these children. It's very hard to keep when we're talking about Indigenous issues or politics, you're supposed to be unbiased and be very objective. But when you are paying attention and you really see how the whole process behind Bill C-15 and how we got to this moment was more of the same. It wasn't as traumatic and violent as stealing children and putting them in the ground, but to testify on behalf of Bill C-15 or to critique it, if you were invited by Senate or who were consulted, there were no grassroots people. So the traditional organizations, Ron Tremblay and the Willistic Grand Council, the Willistic Grandmothers, District 7, Guess-Pagay-Wagi, that's where I'm from. Gary Metallic is the traditional chief in that area. None of these organizations were consulted. What Canada is doing instead for our people here, there's two different negotiation tables. What they're doing for our people here is treating every First Nation as if it is its own nation. So they're dealing with my community, Eel River Bar, Bigunjik, as if they're their own nation, and negotiating with them and getting them to agree to policies. There's another article here, getting them to agree to policies. So on paper, it looks as if the nation of Mi'kmaq peoples at Eel River Bar are giving up their rights or signing into it. But if you talk to a lot of people from my community, even people who are chief and councilors, they don't understand the material that's in it. It's a very it's very poor politics is what it is.
And I think that's been one of the challenges for the settler community, because the media might report that the band chiefs in British Columbia are supporting the pipeline. And then, but the elders, traditional chiefs are saying no. And
also, to interrupt you for 1 minute, also on top of that, you have talked about in this book, and there's a lot of people that speak about that, where they use the funding, because our community is dependent on funding from Indian Affairs, which comes directly from our Crown lands. If we don't sign those paperwork, if any of our chief and counselors were to take a moral stand and stand up against it, because every First Nation is incorporated, you follow under these kind of corporate policies. And so then it's a lot easier to control dissent. So there's a lot of people who, if you work for the Band Council, you're not allowed to post on social media. You're not allowed to have an opinion on these political issues. And people, you want to do a good job. You want to do your job, so you're not going to question it. You're going to believe what people are telling you.
Sure.
So it's just very nefarious, and and I think if more settlers knew about how we got to this moment. I mean, Canada and there are a lot of prominent, like Pam Palmater was someone that spoke out on behalf in support of Bill C-15. I was really surprised at that, because of the question. For me, the cornerstone of my resistance to that is the underlying Crown title.
Right.
It does nothing to change that.
Yeah.
It assumes that. So what Sharon Venn talks about in her article is the comprehensive land claims policy. That's a policy. That is something that you settlers, that all of us Canadians can do something about. Because as far as I understand, policies can be undone a lot easier than statutes or laws or anything like that.
Sure.
And I just wanted to last thing, I saw Sherry Pasternak, one of the directors at the Yellowhead Institute at Ryerson, shared this Wither the Indian Act. I'll share it with you. It's by Susan Collis. And in this abstract, she says that between 2005 and 2020, there were nearly 50 federal statutes passed by successive governments, policies aimed at replacing some of the key parts of the Indian Act around land, around title, access, indigenous rights. So we're making a big deal out of getting rid of, moving beyond the Indian Act, but a lot of the colonizing, controlling first, third world ideologies within that are still held in place by the comprehensive land claim policy, the fiscal management policy. So it's death by policy. And that's where I try to reach to a lot of non-Indigenous peoples, however you choose to identify. That's how they're coming after you too. I mean, eventually, right? Like in rural communities right now, from closures of to not providing enough funding for elder care homes or elder care workers. There's been how many issues have we seen in the media because of that? Teachers becoming fired, teacher assistants, not enough money in the schools. And why is that? That's because of policies. And we have to become aware of it. I'm almost days like today where I feel really low energy and depressed and angry and all this. Sometimes I feel like I wish I was still a high school teacher, where I just worried about this, like the next semester or whatever, and I didn't care about the politics. There wasn't an onus on that. But I feel like it's really hard. It's like, for anyone who's studied Western philosophy and the allegory of the cave, that's exactly how I've been feeling lately. If you want to take a look at that. But I'll be quiet there. I think we're at the half-hour mark.
Yeah, I think we'll pause here, and that's a kind of good moment to.
Yeah, I'm a feel like crying, so it's a good time to stop.
Yeah.